There's fear. I'm getting older. My biological clock is ticking. I have a time limit here and there's a finite amount of time. Or all my friends are getting married and I'm the last man standing, and that's kind of embarrassing and makes me feel insecure. A lot of people get into relationships and they think they're going to be the ones to fix this person. That means that you view them as flawed in some way. You're seeing this person, your partner, your would be life partner, as a project, not a teammate, a project. Nowadays, it's like almost even worse because we have social media creating this idealized but totally unrealistic expectation of what a relationship should be. And I find
Today's guest is Sarah Intelligator, a family lawyer and author of Live, Laugh, Find True Love. With nearly 2 decades of experience practicing exclusively in family law, Sarah brings both sharp legal expertise and deep compassion to some of life's most challenging transitions. Stay tuned as Sarah shares the 6 fail factors you need to succeed in love. Red flag you wish people would stop ignoring in relationships?
I think it's the fact that they don't necessarily share fundamental values with their partner. And when I say fundamental values, I'm not talking about things like superficial interests or things that we think that we have in common, even though they don't really speak to like a deeper system of morality or something that
Mhm.
like we really, really value.
I love that, and I know you've got a really helpful exercise in your book. Can you talk us through that helps us to kind of dig a little bit deeper what our values are obviously now, but also what they may look like in the future?
Yeah, so I have several exercises in the book that identify they try to help people identify what their fundamental values are. So, first I have them look at what they value right now because that's a really easy thing to do. And sometimes the things we value now may not be the things that we value in the future, which means they're not really fundamental values, and that's
Mhm.
kind of how we can distinguish them. And then I have people look at what they wrote down, the list of the fundament or the things that they value right now, and then I ask them to think about whether these are things that seemingly are sort of fleeting, like things that they're going to value right now only, but maybe not necessarily into their 30s or 40s or 50s or 60s. Or maybe they are. Like, for example, like faith is one that somebody who is really, really spiritual or follows or believes in a certain faith, that might be something that it has always been important to them and will be important to them for the rest of their lives. And so that might be more something that's a fundamental value. Whereas, for instance, we can look at something like wanderlust, like a love for travel. And when you're in your 20s, you might want to travel all over the world and, sell off all your material possessions and go out and travel and backpack through Europe for a month. And that's great. That might not necessarily be a fundamental value because ultimately you might decide, well, I want to have children, I want to have a family, I want to settle down, I want to get married, I want to have a career. And obviously, backpacking through Europe is not necessarily aligned with those goals. And so maybe the fundamental value there underlying that wanderlust, there's something deeper. There's the wanderlust is a superficial and fleeting interest, but the underlying value, the fundamental value is maybe a need for adventure. And that might, looking at that and kind of thinking about it in terms of your future goals, it might sort of inform your understanding of what your actual fundamental values are, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. And I love that because obviously, when we're looking for a partner, we're looking for someone for the long term. And as you said, it's not that our fundamental values shift, but what they look like does. And so, being able to identify that sense of adventure over, necessarily being able to backpack in Europe for a couple of months is really, really important. And I think people really struggle with that. So I found that exercise super helpful and really practical. So that's one of your I know in your book you have 6 Fs, and you obviously have a very unique perspective being a divorce attorney and working with people at the end of their relationships, having seen maybe where we could have done things differently from the start. Can you talk us through those 6 key foundations or those 6 Fs that you identify in the book?
Right. So, yeah, the F is short for fail factors, and as you said, I'm a divorce attorney, so I have identified these 6 patterns that I see in all relationships that fail. I've been practicing family law for close to 20 years, so this is something that I see time and time and time again. so much so that I've identified them as these like patterns, right, that people need to avoid. And so fundamental values was the first one we talked about that. But another one is well, I'll go through all of them. There's fear, foundation, fairy tale, family, and fixing. So those are the other five, and I can get into any of those if you'd like to discuss them.
Sounds great. Let's talk about fear first, because I know that that is such a common, particularly for me being a couples therapist and working with people, that fear really gets in the way of vulnerability. Our insecurities can actually stop us getting what we want. So I'd really love for you to unpack fear.
Man, fear is one of those things that I think really debilitates us as human beings and stops us from achieving our full potential. And I think
Mhm.
that is truly across the board, but specifically in the context of relationships. I think people end up staying in relationships because they're afraid I might not find someone better. What if this is the best I will ever find? And then if they know that the relationship is not necessarily right or right for the long term, they still stay because they think I might not find someone else like this.
Mhm.
And so they're making a decision for the rest of their lives, knowing that it's not necessarily the right person, but fear is making the decision, right? The fear that there might not be somebody else. So I'll just stick with what's safe.
Mm.
There's fear. "Oh, I'm getting older. My biological clock is ticking. I have a time limit here, and there's a finite amount of time. Or all my friends are getting married and I'm the last man standing, and that's kind of embarrassing and makes me feel insecure. There's so many ways that fear manifests itself in the context of relationships, but people it really it talks people into staying in relationships they should not be in.
On a deeper level, they know, but I think on that surface level, it's really hard in the moment when you've got all those emotions flowing. And as you said, there's this love for this person in front of you, which brings me to the next one I want to talk about, which is fixing, because I think this is also very common, is that we get caught wanting to fix our partner and thinking that's possible. So can you unpack fixing a little bit more for us?
Sure. So fixing it's sort of a two-parter. So it's fixing your partner, but it's also fixing yourself. So I'll focus on fixing your partner first. So a lot of people get into relationships and they think they're going to be the ones to fix this person.
Mhm.
Now, that means that this person is you view them as flawed in some way, right? You're seeing this person, your partner, your would-be life partner as a project, not a teammate, a project. And so you are, and I see this a lot specifically with women, is they see that someone is emotionally unavailable. This is like a great classic example. And they think they are going to be the one woman who's going to suddenly, they're so amazing and so wonderful that this guy who's emotionally unavailable and never wants to commit, has commitment issues, whatever it is, he's going to commit to them. Like that's it. Like they're going to be the ones to change him, right? Or we see, someone who's not necessarily right for us. Like maybe their fundamental values don't align with ours, but we're going to talk them into it. We're going to fix that problem. Or they have some sort of, personality flaw. And that doesn't mean they're flawed. It means it's not necessarily correct for us. And we just feel like we're going to be the ones to come in and change that. And the thing is that in the beginning of a relationship, people typically put their best foot forward. So, and over the course of a relationship, as they feel they get more comfortable, they sort of let their guard down, they're not as inclined to try to impress anymore. So, what makes somebody think that as a relationship progresses, that somebody is going to be more likely to change and bend and become something that they're not than they were in the beginning when they weren't that to begin with? So, I think that there's this whole illusion that we can if we just tweak something, if we just change something, this person's going to be the perfect partner, and that is not the way to go into a relationship. And the second part of that is we have to go into a relationship having fixed ourselves. We all have our flaws. We all have our issues and they make us unique. But when our flaws, our past traumas, our past experiences are selecting our life partner, then we are not selecting, we're not in the driver's seat. Our trauma is in the driver's seat selecting the partner, and we're just kind of in the passenger seat along for the ride. So we need to be the ones who are coming from a place where we are whole, we have addressed whatever we need to address, and we are intellect or we are selecting our partner, not these traumas and past issues.
Absolutely. So, what you're speaking to really there is those sort of attached well, there's a lot of things, but can be those attachment behaviors. It can be those ways of coping that we've learnt that may have been adaptive earlier in our life or in other relationships, but are maladaptive in a healthy relationship. And I think where people often get stuck is that, yes, it is possible to change those, as you said, when you're talking about yourself, to do that work before you go into the relationship and to continue to do that work in the relationship, but that we can't force someone else to do that work. That person can equally change those behaviors. So we can't change someone's personality. That's not possible, but they might be able to change those behaviors. But what you're really talking about is when we think that we can make someone change when they are not a willing participant in that process. We can all change, but it has to be driven by us. And I love that you're focusing on that idea of doing that work before we get into the relationship, which is so important. One of the other areas I love that you talk about is the foundation, and I feel like this is kind of the crux of all the work I do is building those skills. Can you unpack what you mean by the foundation and what that looks like practically?
Sure. So, foundation, I liken it to the foundation of a house. So, you don't need to know anything about construction to know that your house rests on a foundation. Usually, if it's a raised foundation, there are a bunch of support beams that hold it up and keep it from toppling down, essentially. And when one of those beams is not intact, right, the foundation is faulty, the house could start shifting or tilting, or, ultimately, if those beams are really decrepit, the house could fall down. So, I liken the foundation of a relationship to these beams that support the house. They're the beams that support the
Mhm.
relationship. And I break them down into five, what I call pillars, as in the beams that hold up the relationship. And those are respect, communication, trust, honesty, and teamwork.
I love those, and I think, one of the things I believe that we all really need is to learn skills around those. So, often people weren't fortunate enough to grow up in households where they had this modeled to them, or where they learnt this maybe in school growing up. And I think it's so important that we learn some of those skills. So when you talk about something like communication, for example, we really need to learn those relationship skills, don't we, around like how do we communicate well, or how do we build trust in a relationship? It's so fundamental. So what have you seen in terms of that, where that does get in the way of long-term happiness in relationships in any of those areas?
Well, communication specifically is one of those things that I see. Communication is not only how we communicate, it's whether we communicate, it's do we listen. And I think that it's so complex, and it's kind of like a book unto itself almost, communication styles. But I love to use examples because I think that poor communication or communicating ineffectively can ultimately lead to resentment. I think like all roads lead to resentment, and then that leads to divorce. I don't see like I don't see a lot of comeback from when we get to that point of extreme resentment. That's where most people lead, or who end up divorced. They've come to that point of extreme resentment. So, I think we also train each other how to communicate, and I love there's classic example, kind of cliche. It's like a woman will put on an outfit and she'll ask her, boyfriend or husband or whatever. She'll be like, "Well, what do you think? How do I look?" And he'll say, he has 2 options. He can say, let's say she doesn't look that great in it. He can say, "Well, it's not particularly flattering on you. I've seen, you're beautiful. I've seen you look much better in other things. Um, you know, I, I don't think it's particularly flattering." Or he can say, "Ugh, that's disgusting. You look so fat and hideous in that," or whatever. Right. So saying the same thing in two totally different ways. Now, let's say he says it the first way and she is receptive. That's great. But let's say he says it the first way and she's not receptive to it. She was fishing for compliments, she was looking to be flattered, she thought she looked great in it. So even though he said it really respectfully and communicated honestly, which is one of the pillars here, um, she had a really bad reaction, And so she almost conditioned him and negatively reinforced him being honest and him communicating. And so she's now knocked down 2 of those pillars, and she basically what the message she sent was, "If you communicate honestly, then, you're not gonna get a good response." So now what does he do? He shuts down, and the next time she asked for his opinion, he said, "Yeah, you look fine, you look great." Even if he doesn't mean it. And it might be something innocuous like, "How do I look in what I'm wearing?" But it could translate into other things where he doesn't wanna get his head bitten off, things that are far more serious, and he just ultimately clams up, retreats into himself, and doesn't wanna deal with it. So she's conditioned him through her communication not to be honest and not to communicate effectively, and not to communicate at all. Um, and I think that's such a classic example, because ultimately, if you want to communicate with your partner and you want honest and respectful communication, then you need to be prepared for whatever answer is given and not be fishing for a specific answer. So I just love that example specifically because I think it covers so much and it's so emblematic of human behavior and like what people do, like a very common relationship dynamic.
So what you're really highlighting for me is that pattern that happens in relationships. And I think this is where I see in my work so many couples get stuck is that, often we're communicating in a way that maybe doesn't land well for our partner or our partner doesn't interpret it the way that we intended it. And then we get stuck in these patterns, as you highlighted, she's responded one way to his communication, and therefore he shifted his communication moving forward, and neither of them are really getting their needs met in that context. And I think that's so important in relationship is that the work doesn't stop when we build skills before we go into the relationship. It's understanding the patterns in our own relationship that may emerge and how we work to shift them, each from our own perspective in that. And I think that is so fundamental. So I absolutely love that example that you gave. Another one that you cover is family. Can you talk us through the
I'm
fail
gonna laugh,
factor
but
of family? I understand because it's a huge one and I see a lot
yeah.
in my room as well.
Mhm.
Can you talk us through like how can we get ahead of that from the outset rather than when we enter your room or mine?
Yeah. I initially didn't actually include family as one of the fail factors, and then afterwards, I was like, "No, it's kind of a big deal because 'cause I've seen so
Mhm.
many relationships fall apart because of family," and so family can encompass many things. Family could be somebody is really close to his or her family, and in that case, that family is going to be a part of your collective lives if you end up spending your life with this person. And so, if the family doesn't like you or you don't like the family, there's going to be a lot of tension, to put it lightly. If your partner, let's just say, a man is close to his mother and sister or whatever it is, and the mother and sister don't like this man's wife. Right? Well, but this man feels an allegiance to his wife, but he feels an allegiance to his family. And so he's gonna constantly be torn between the 2. Like, he's gonna have it, in both ears. Someone is talking to him in both ears at all times, and he's gonna feel like, "Well, I have to be loyal to my wife, and I have to defend her, but then I also have to defend my mom and my sister." It creates a lot of problems. I think family also can be an amazing clue. When we're dating, we're looking at the whole picture. We're looking at all the little puzzle pieces and all the little clues to put together the bigger picture to determine whether this person fits the position, they get the job, life partner, husband, wife, whatever it might be. And when we look to someone's family dynamic, we can learn a lot. If someone isn't if a man is not speaking to his mother, for instance, and his mother basically stops speaking to him, well, this man have may feel the need if he hasn't addressed these issues. He might feel the need to date a mother figure, somebody to fill that void that his mother left. And so he might seek a partner, not who's an equal and not who's a teammate, but a partner who sort of fulfills that need for a mother, who kind of fills that sort of empty space within him. And the problem there, obviously, is nobody wants to feel like somebody else's mommy in a relationship. And also, then this man eventually, like, no one wants to have sex with their mommy, so that might be something that will become a problem later on down the road. I think that so, I mean, I'm using this just as an example, but
Yeah.
looking to if someone's speaking to his family or her family and or not speaking to his or her family, why? Look at the family dynamic. Are the parents still together? Are the parents divorced? Did they have a really nasty divorce? Has this person addressed the issues that that divorce might have caused and how it impacted him or her? And, just kind of looking at all the clues. If the person's really close to their family, that might be a great thing. But again, does the family approve of you? Do they not approve of you? There might be a reason for that. Maybe families sometimes know best. They maybe know, um, who's right for their child or their sibling. Or it might be a super overbearing mother who thinks that nobody's good enough for her son and she's going to make you feel like, you're horrible, even if you're a great person and a great match. So, is that something you want to live with for your whole life? Probably not, no matter how great her son is, or this guy is. So, I think there's just so many clues that family can offer.
Absolutely, and I love that you're talking about that sort of digging deeper because it's not actually the family in itself that's problematic. It's really about our awareness of, because there's issues in all families,
Of course.
obviously, but it's really about, that level of awareness and insight that we may have around unhelpful dynamics or how we put boundaries in place around that. How we navigate that as a couple is so important. And
Mhm.
as you said, in those first instances where things go wrong, how does your partner navigate that with you or not navigate that with you? So I love that idea of, being able to dig a little bit deeper around the dynamics of the family interactions and how we will cope with that, or how they cope with that individually and how we might manage that as a couple. There is so many fairy tale stories out there. We're kind of primed from it from a very young age. So we have
Mhm.
these ideas around relationships that may not be realistic. Can you unpack that idea of fairy tales as one of your fail factors?
Fairy tales, I think that nowadays it's like almost even worse because we have social media creating this idealized but totally unrealistic expectation of what a relationship should be. And I find personally that the people who post more about how wonderful their relationship is online, that they tend to have the worst relationships. And yet we sit here and we emulate that
Mhm.
relationship and compare our own relationship to that, and not knowing that deep down inside that relationship is like really horrible and falling apart. So I think, fairy tale is sort of the reason it's an F word is because I think people have this overly idealized notion of marriage, the proposal, having a baby, all of these things, they are overly idealized and romanticized, and that's not necessarily indicative of the reality of these things, right? We hear, okay, and Cinderella and Prince Charming lived happily ever after, but they were probably in their early to mid 20s when they got married, right? And then they went on to live however many years after that. We don't hear about the next 40, 50, 60, 70 years of their
Mhm.
lives. But we all know that life is not ideal. Life is like daily hardships, life is stress. Also, Cinderella and Prince Charming were royalty. They had servants and, every and endless copious amounts of money. They never had to deal with financial stresses. Someone loses their job, how are we gonna support our family? They probably have night nurses to take care of their children, and they're not being woken up at all odd hours of the night and at each other's throats because they're so tired and stressed out taking care of their children. So, um, we kind of tend to think like the wedding day is the most important day of our lives, or I can't wait to post
Mhm.
this fairy tale proposal on social media so everyone can see it, so all my friends can see it. And none of these things are about who we're choosing to spend our lives with. It's like anybody will fit that bill so long as they propose and you have a wedding. And our perspective should sort of shift, and it should more be about the person with whom we are going to spend our lives and making sure that that person is a good partner and a teammate and somebody who has all those foundational pillars intact, like we have respect and good communication and honesty and trust, and we share fundamental values, and those things are so much more important than the wedding day. The wedding day is probably unpopular opinion, but the least important day of your entire life because it's not really indicative of what the day-to-day life with this partner is going to be like.
Absolutely, and I love that idea that you're painting, that it is a real bubble that we see, like, whether that be on social media, whether that be the fairy tale stories, we're not seeing the full picture, and a lot of those challenges that come up in relationships, like, I often think one of the biggest factors in what makes a relationship work is that commitment, not just a commitment to the person, but a commitment to doing the work necessary to make the relationship work, because there will be hurdles. There will be times where we have to face things that maybe we don't want to face, but we need to. And, just listening to you talk, I'm thinking about the idea of this framework obviously can be used when we're dating at the start of a relationship. So using it as a bit of a checklist to, and I know you talk about that in the book around having a bit of an interview process, for want of a better word. But also for people in relationships now, because some of these things can be addressed. So how could we apply that if we are in a relationship? Can we apply some learnings from those six areas?
Yeah, I specifically I think that, fundamental values, well, you kind of either share them or you don't, although you can maybe
Mhm.
cultivate some fundamental values that you have in common. But I think foundation is one of those that it kind of needs to be there before you enter into a relationship, but I think a foundation can be knocked down and repaired and all of these things and needs to be worked at throughout the relationship. So, in my example about the wife asking about the outfit that she tries on and, that's communication, right? So in my example, she says her husband says, "Well, you're beautiful. I just don't think that's particularly flattering on you." And she goes ballistic on him. Well, instead of going ballistic, maybe she felt so great and that answer kind of deflated her ego a little bit or, her sense of self. Maybe instead of reacting the way she did, a good communication tool would have been to say, "You know what? I totally understand. I was fishing for a compliment here. I should have just, if I didn't want the honest answer, I shouldn't have asked the question. But I've been feeling pretty down on myself lately, and I looked in the mirror and I thought that I looked really great. And then I heard you say that and kind of was a bummer for me." And then they can really open up the conversation about what else is going on, what's underlying that. Maybe underlying that is she hasn't felt very beautiful or attractive lately, and maybe there's something that her husband could do to reinforce her feelings of being attractive or to support that, and we all have those moments. It's not like an insecurity all the time sort of thing where I need constant compliments. But it's
Mhm.
it's like, well, there was an opportunity there to discuss what's going on deeper and for them to have a conversation about it and support each other through it, or there was an opportunity to create to knock down the foundational pillars and to take the
Mhm.
relationship in a bad direction. And you kind of have a choice, but I think, sometimes you can bring it back. I think if you knock down the pillar of trust and maybe honesty, I don't know, and maybe even respect, I don't know if there's any coming back from that. But I think that if we, work at our communication skills, that we can really kind of engender a lot more trust and respect and teamwork and things like that.
Absolutely, and I think that intentionality is so important. I think, in my experience, even something like trust, we can repair, but it is so, so difficult. And that is one of those things where I think you really do need expert help if you want to try and repair trust, because there is, clear ways that you can do that, but it's complicated and it does take a lot of work. And a lot of people, aren't willing to step into that space, which is absolutely understandable. But the other thing that you're really highlighting is that things like communication are so important. And I think even in terms of, interestingly, when you're talking, I was thinking about fundamental values, because I agree with you. Like, we don't shift our values, but one of the places I see couples get stuck is communication around our values. Because what can happen is we get stuck, and I'm sure you've seen this, fighting on like the surface level, the nitty-gritty of things, the things that we identify as facts, etc. And we get so stuck in that reactive communication that we are no longer communicating from that deeper emotional awareness of what it is that we really want and need. So, we're fighting about something that's not really what the issue is. And so I think, I love that idea of our fundamental values, because it is often about how do we dig deeper and identify what it is that I really need in this situation and communicate from that place. John Gottman talks about this idea of like 69% of issues that we have in the relationship are unresolvable conflicts, but it comes down to that communication. I think when we talk about values, it is about being able to identify what is the deeper need that I have and having the courage to communicate that to our partner, which is a difficult thing to do. As you said, when we think about that fear, stepping into that vulnerability can be really, really hard.
Yeah, I think it is, and I also think that when people enter into a relationship or they start dating, they sort of put this really overly idealized version of themselves out there, and it's not authentic. It's not who you are. And you know that if you continue dating this person and you let your guard down, that eventually they're going to see the real you, the authentic you. So to me, I think that if you're afraid to be who you are around a particular person or around anyone, that's a you issue. That goes back to fixing. You need to work on that because, I think that we need to go into it just being like unapologetically, this is who I am, this is what you get, and if you don't like what you see and you don't like what you get, then on to the next, right? And it's not about like, "Oh, I'm the best ever," and having this giant ego about yourself, but I think that it's important to understand that if this relationship progress like, we're so afraid to just be who we are, show who we really are, then it kind of accelerates things in a way because we end up ultimately, when the infatuation wears off and all of that, ultimately we let our guard down. That's when we only begin to start to to embark upon this relationship and the getting to know the other person. Um, and I think if we just are who we are right from the get-go, we're gonna get there much faster and know whether it's right or wrong and then not be so invested if we need to get out.
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. I think that is like the best advice because it's so spot on. All we need to do, I mean, I know it's not as easy as this, obviously, but all we need to do is be our complete selves because we want that person to love us for who we are. And how can they do that if we are not being who we are? We want that person to meet our needs. How can they do that if we're not communicating our needs? So, it is so simple, but it's so true. Like just being able to show up authentically as ourselves is the pathway to finding the right person for
And
us.
and it also, I think in many ways, if you don't feel that your authentic self is lovable enough, then you don't feel worthy of love. And consequently, you're not going to seek a partner who is, who is worthy of your love and who is worthy of you. You don't, your energy, you're attracting somebody who doesn't deserve the best version of you. Like you're settling in a way for someone who, well, I guess this is the best I'm gonna get because who would love the authentic version of me, right? Whereas if you're like, well, this is who I am, then you love yourself enough to be who you are and expect that somebody is going to love you for that.
Absolutely. And everyone is worthy of love. Everyone deserves that love. And if you are feeling that way, then that is a key signal to you to go and get some support around how to shift that because you do deserve that love. So I love that message. I want to ask you, we love doing a bit of myth busting here. What are some of the biggest myths that you've encountered around love, divorce, or finding the right person?
Hmm. Well, I think that don't go to sleep angry is a big myth. My personal opinion.
Yeah.
I think it's okay to go to sleep angry. Yeah, I mean, I think that if you're angry, sometimes you're not going to communicate in the best way. If you're so seething mad, you might say things that are coming from a really base primal place. You haven't maybe necessarily had the time to cool down so that you can process your thoughts and emotions and speak not from a place of anger, but from a place of truth. And so if you are super supremely angry, um, just, they say, "Oh, don't go to sleep angry." Well, you just for the simple sake of not going to sleep angry, then you're going to have this conversation at a time when you're not in a really good place to approach it. Whereas having some time to reflect and to sit with your thoughts and to process your emotions, you're gonna have a far better conversation, even if that means you have to sleep on it. I mean, there's that saying, you have to sleep on it, right? That's so they also say that, right? They're kind of contradictory things. So I think that's a big myth.
I think that's so important. You're right. It's such a huge myth because I hear that all the time. Even when I'm talking to people about the idea of like, we need to take a break because we're in that reactive communication. And that's when we say really hurtful things to our partners, where we do a lot of damage to our relationship and to ourselves. So it's really important that we take those breaks. And people will often come back with that and say, but isn't it true that we're supposed to not go to bed angry at each other? So I love that you've addressed that one because it's so important that we take the time to regulate ourselves, whether that be sleep, whether that be taking a break before we go into those conversations, so that we can manage communication effectively and get our needs met. I want to ask you one last question. If you had a magic wand and you could impart one piece of knowledge or one skill on all humans when it comes to love, what would that be?
Know your worth and to value yourself enough to hold out for the right relationship for you, not just to settle for any relationship because you don't think you're worth better or because your fear is telling you that you might not do better or you'll never find anyone better because it's simply not true.
I love that. It's just the starting point, isn't it? It's the foundation for finding the right person for you. Thank you so much for your time. I'm sure people are having listened are keen to get your book. Where can they find it?
So they can find it on Amazon or anywhere books are sold. It's called,
Mhm.
I'm botching that. It's called Live, Laugh, Find True Love. And they can also find me on my website, which is lafamilylawpractice.com. There's a link to the book there. And my Instagram, which is sarah.a.intelligator.esq. There's also a link to the book there. So lots of places to find me.
Perfect. And we'll pop all those in the show notes as well. Thank you so much for your time, Sarah. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Subscribe for more conversations filled with new insights, inspiration, and practical tools to create a life you love.